Alright guys, so last time we left off with the situation around the rest of the world. In this video we're going to focus in on Europe and what slavery was like in Europe, and then what Christianity did to change that. So first let's talk about what the situation was like in Europe. Well, the ancient Greeks and the Romans had sort of a shared culture and empire. They were very similar, and they didn't really see a problem with slavery. So I'll give you an example. The Greek philosopher Archimedes, the one who's famous for saying Eureka when he discovered the principle of displacement. So when he realized he could measure the volume of strange objects by putting them in water and seeing how much water is displaced. He expressed that he felt bad, he felt ashamed of himself for constructing some machines to help, and physical machines to help him figure out some geometry. Because there was this belief that like working with your hands is bad because it makes you dumber, and to be a true lover of wisdom, which is what a philosopher is, that's what that means, a lover of wisdom, it should be purely intellectual pursuits. So there was this disdain and disgust for anything that involved actually using your hands to figure anything out. It should be purely theoretical, purely mental. That's the true lover of knowledge. The slavery in general was seen as like a necessary evil. You know, people needed the food, they needed to eat. And so no one really had a problem with it, or wanted to abolish it. It was seen more like it's just the way things are. It just has to be that way. And in some cases it was actually defended as a good thing, as like a moral virtue. Like Aristotle famously defended it. Seneca is a later Roman philosopher who he thought it was a bad thing, but that it was important that it must continue, that you had to have it. It was just something you had to do. It was like, because essentially the point is they thought work was a necessary evil. It was just something you have to do, but it's a bad thing, and that's what slaves are for. It's essentially, that's the idea. So Seneca even believed in a concept of human equality, which is something that's going to be more important as we move into Christianity. But he didn't believe in human equality. When he believed in, what he believed was that all humans had certain things in common, and one of those was the ability to reason, and but he didn't think all people were, really of equal value, but that all people had certain things in common that kind of made them human. So anyway, some numbers. In general, in the ancient Greek world, if you generally, as a citizen, as one of the rich people, which would be the aristoi or the citizens, you own 2 slaves. And if you lost all your slaves, then that was considered an analogous situation today would be if someone went into bankruptcy and lost their house. Because if you lost your slaves, it meant you have to work for your own food, and that was considered, what a tragedy. What a horrible thing happened to that guy. That would be like the bank taking your house away and losing your job. In our sense, losing your 2 slaves. That's the way they saw that. The Romans exploited slavery on a much more incredible scale, and part of this was due to just an extreme military superiority. So Julius Caesar's wars in France, or what's called the Gallic Wars, they weren't called France then, it was called Gaul, but he brought back 1 million slaves in his Gallic Wars. That's what the records say. The Roman Empire, as it became more powerful, it exploited slavery on a larger level, and so they had a problem where people were manumitting or freeing slaves. So that's the word for freeing a slave, manumission. And the government was worried that the reason they were freeing slaves is because they could just get a new slave for nothing, and then the new slave would work for them, and they just didn't see a point in taking care of the old slave. Just throw it away and get a new one, kind of thing. Hadn't been feeding it good, it's in bad shape, just throw it away and get a new one. That was the idea. And so there was a concern that, like, as the Roman Empire really became a big thing, kind of around the time of Jesus and Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars and that kind of thing, there was a real issue. And so the Roman government actually passed laws against the freeing of slaves. So, like, you couldn't free a slave that was under 30 years old. Well, making it to 30 as a slave was pretty good. Like, you had really made it. Like, in other words, they're not going to feed you. And, most of the poor people are going to live to about 30 in that period. That's when you live. And that's not, that's not like, people die as babies and it throws the average down, but really they live to 50. No, you live to 30. Okay, unless you were rich and you make it to like 60, you had enough food and your life wasn't terrible. And especially just having enough food was like a major thing. So, like, slaves regularly died of starvation in the Roman Empire, and it just, no one cares. Like, because they could just get another slave. The Romans knew how to, like, use, like, so for example, in their mines, they could have used horses to turn their pumps to pump rainwater out of their mines, but they thought, why would I waste a horse for that? I could use a slave. They're famous for their sacred games where they would have their slaves fight to the death for their amusement. The Romans, I think at the height of their empire, 1 out of every 16 humans was in some way under the thumb of the Roman Empire on this planet, that's a pretty big empire, for back then. The the fall of Rome, what is it, like 480, 496 or something? Or no, I'm sorry, 396. Okay. Back it up 100 years. Somewhere in there, I don't know. Around the year 400. So that gives you a gist of it, and the pinnacle of their empire really is around 50, when their great period begins around then, the period of Augustus, and called the Peace of Rome, the Pax Romana. So anyway, the Romans, here's some numbers I can throw at you. In the main portion of the Roman Empire was, of course, the Italian Peninsula. In the Italian Peninsula, 90% of the people were in poverty. So the 30% of the people were slaves, and they regularly, wouldn't make it, 28, you're doing good. Life expectancy for women was even worse because pregnancy was a deadly venture. And then, all women were, in the Roman Empire, women didn't have the ability to say no to get married to someone. And they were often married very young. And as soon as that law changed, women started getting married, immediately. They were getting married later in life. They were, and to people that they chose. So anyway, let's see. Where do we go next? So the bottom 30% is slaves. The next 30% are these poor people that have had their land confiscated by the empire. So what the Roman Empire did is they took the land of the poor people, and so that they could have huge slave plantations for the slaves to work, so that they could have wealth and big farms for the rich people. The rich people are 10%, the top 10%. So the other 90% are the poor people. 30%, 1/3 of the 90 is 30%. Is like slaves. The next third are poor people who don't have any land to farm because it was taken to create huge slave plantations called latifundia. So what the Roman Empire did is they were worried that, like, all of these people who've had their land taken they'll rebel, and we'll have this crisis on our hands. And so to maintain power, what they did is they gave them free handouts of bread from the plantations. But these people lived in a constant state of starvation, so they weren't doing well at all. So as far as food goes, as a slave, you're just constantly getting beat up all the time, and no one cares, and you die, and they get another slave. Like, it's just not great being a slave. But even as these poor people, starvation was a regular, consistent thing. Okay, and they also would entertain them. It was called the bread and circuses. Give them bread and give them, various forms of entertainment like the gladiatorial games and chariot races and stuff. And then the poor people won't revolt. You'll keep them satisfied. And apparently this system worked. There was a slave revolt under Spartacus, but it was put down by the Roman government eventually. And I'm sure there were other slave revolts I don't know about. But anyway, the next 15%, so you basically, remember 90% is poor, and so then that's 3/3, that's 3/30s. So then the next 30 is divided between 15% who were poor, but they had land to farm, and they were on the brink of starvation, but they survived. And then you had the next 15% who had achieved stability, but they were just above starvation. Okay, and so then that rounds it out, and then the top 10% are your plebeians and your equestrians and the nobility. So sometimes it might be confusing. You talk about the plebeians out there or the plebs. Yeah, but those plebeians were in the top 10%. So the nobility looked down on them, but like the top 10%, were everything. Now, around the rest of the Roman Empire, 40% of the people were not in poverty, and the other 60% lived in poverty. Anyway, the Roman Empire exploited slavery on a massive scale. Okay. So then we get to Christianity. And this is where things get interesting. Christianity enters the scene, and we're going to take a look at what the New Testament said. So I'm going to take you to Ephesians 6. This is what Paul writes about slavery. And we're going to take a look at the situation. And so, you imagine you're the Apostle Paul, and you've got to, have a teaching about slavery and that sort of thing. And there's this sort of question of like, well, what do I do? Do I tell Christian converts like, hey guys, free your slaves? And do I tell the slaves who are now Christians, hey guys, slavery's wrong, you should escape or something? Okay. The problem with either of those activities is that they're both illegal. So if Paul tells people to do that, then he's going to be telling people to break the law. So that's going to be a problem. Paul doesn't want to necessarily say, hey everybody, let's break the law, and every law under the sun under the Roman Empire. And at the same time, he doesn't want to say like, hey everybody, let's just be okay with this slavery thing. And so what essentially the Christians do is they have sort of a unique solution to the problem. And the way it works is, if you turn to Ephesians 6, you're going to see a portion in there. It's slaves, obey your masters. And Paul goes through this spiel about how the slaves are supposed to obey their masters. So I'm going to read it to you from the King James Version here. So that'll be interesting for us. Ephesians 6. And he talks about children obeying your parents, and then, alright. So it says in here, servants, be obedient to them that are your masters. Okay, it's just slaves. So the King James translators keep changing the King James translation, and this is a translation from like Heavens to Betsy. I don't know when this copy, 1984 version. It's slaves. So anyway, it's slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters. Okay, so it's like slaves, obey your masters. Okay, but he doesn't stop there. He goes into detail. He's like, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart. In other words, like physically, when they tell you to do something, do it. He doesn't mean like believe in what they tell you to do spiritually, like, the ideas that they teach you. But he says, do it with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. So clearly, Paul's not, he's not saying Jesus has come to abolish slavery. Because, again, if Paul had done that, remember, it's against the law for anyone to free a slave or for slaves to, run away or anything like that. And so if Paul had been going around preaching that, then essentially Christianity would have been a military movement. And this would have been something, this would have been a problem. And so what Paul's going to try to do is try to find a way to get rid of slavery without actually starting a political rebellion and setting up Christianity through military might and force. And that's very important, because you don't want to try to, remember in the last video we talked about, this idea that Ashoka had. He's like, I shouldn't be trying to go on these wars of conquest where I kill hundreds of thousands of people to conquer neighboring lands. Even if I'm doing it to teach them my better moral code, shouldn't I be able to just spread my moral code and convince them by winning the battle of ideas, and it be a religion of the heart? And so you can understand where Paul's coming from. It's like, yeah, we're not going to set up Christianity as like a political nation of Christianity that's going to go declare war on other people. Instead, we're going to, obey the laws. But what he's going to do is do something interesting with slavery here. So he tells the slave to obey the masters. Yeah, he's not going to abolish slavery. And then he goes on and he says, he describes in great detail, he wants the slave to be very obedient to the masters. All right? So he says, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So in other words, you're supposed to obey your master as though he's Jesus himself, which is a pretty high level of obedience. All right? Doing the will of God from the heart, with goodwill doing doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same he shall receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. All right, now, this is the important part that everyone wants to leave out. So if you've seen a video or article online that says that Christianity is pro-slavery, they probably read for you what I just read, which if you just read that, you would think it's pro-slavery. And then they're not going to read for you the next verses. And this is what he says. He says, and ye masters. Okay, so now he's going to tell the masters. He's got a command for the masters too. What are the masters to do? He says, do the same things unto them. Okay, well, he told the slave to obey the master as though the master is Christ. But now he says the master do the same thing to them. Well, that would be obey the slave as though the slave is Christ. So what Paul says is, essentially, once the master and the slave are both Christians, he's not saying you're free. He's saying you obey each other. And we're going to see how influential that becomes later on in the Middle Ages. But it's a system of shared responsibilities to one another. But it's very clear human equality there, right? So, ye masters do the same unto them, forbearing, threatening, yada yada. Okay, so he says, forbearing, threatening. So he says, don't threaten your slaves. Well, like in that case, how do you force a slave to do something without threatening the slave? I mean, it's obvious that that's, not going to work, right? All right, so Paul has an interesting solution to the problem. He's not going to start a rebellion and try to go convince everyone to go kill thousands of people to set up the righteous Christian no slave government. But what he's saying is, as Christianity spreads, slavery will be abolished, because people just will follow Christ and they won't, but they'll, he's saying obey each other and stay in the household. He does say in other places, if you can, get slavery legally, of course, obtain it. I mean, not slavery, manumission or freedom, of course, obtain it. Okay, so this introduces some concepts that are an issue. And so what happens is the New Testament introduces ideas, and a way for you to understand this is it puts the worm in the wood. So it's like a little worm, or it's like termites. These Bible verses become termites, and slavery is a house. And you just introduce a few termites, and they're little, but over time they destroy the whole house. And so over time what you have is more and more momentum building for this anti-slavery thing. As we move into the Middle Ages, it's eventually going to get abolished in the Middle Ages. But this momentum is built on simple ideas here in the New Testament. Another one of these important ideas, let's see, is in the previous book of Galatians. Alright, and I don't... Okay. Let's make sure I read. This is Galatians chapter 3. He says, starting in verse 26, we'll start there. For ye are all children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. And if ye be Christ, then ye are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So like you're children of Abraham, and therefore you are inheritors. So in other words, he's saying once someone's a Christian in Christ, they are like a child. It's like you're the highest level royalty, because now you are literally, in in other words, in Galatians 3, he's talking about how Christ represents the true child of Abraham. And he is a descendant of Abraham, but he's the true inheritor of Abraham's promise that God promised to him. And so the most uplifted position you can have is to be Jesus. But because you've been baptized or immersed, that it means immersed into Christ, you are all, one in Christ. All right, so you're all children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. So, you're the highest level of royalty possible. So, in other words, from the perspective of verses like that, you can't, we're all equal. Once we're Christians, it's like we're all the same. We can't put ourselves above another person. And we're all of infinite value. You're all the most important of the important. The Christians are going to argue later in the Middle Ages, and arguments are going to be made around 1200 AD, is that since anyone can become a Christian, therefore you can't really enslave anyone else either who isn't a Christian. So in the Middle Ages, what they're going to do is they're going to, over time, there's going to be opposition from Christians who want to defend slavery. But you're also going to get other Christians who say, no, it's got to go, on the basis of things like this in the New Testament. And eventually the anti-slavery people win the argument and slavery is abolished. But in the Middle Ages, they only abolished slavery of Christians and Jews. So you can still enslave non-Christians and, or anyone that's not a Christian or a Jew. So a small slave trade continues of basically foreign slaves, because in Europe in that period, by 1000 AD is when they finally achieve it. In Europe, slavery is, you're not going to find anyone that's not a Christian or a Jew. So essentially there is no slavery in Europe by 1000 AD. Before 1000 AD, there would have been, pagan remnants, 800 or something like that. But by 1000 AD, essentially there's no slavery in Europe. A small slave trade continued in foreign slaves, and then the church argues against that. By the 1200s, the church has made it its position that, like, none of that either. Okay, and that was an argument too, but eventually they say none of that either. And then so then the Catholic Church essentially is going to have like a permanent stance of no slavery ever, and that's just going to be, they're just going to hold that, that's that for them. And they just continue to hold it. Slavery is going to make a comeback, and we're going to talk about how slavery makes a comeback, but as you'll see, it's not going to be, it's only going to be foreign slaves, and you can see how basically they were exploiting an old loophole. In the Middle Ages, they didn't have the ability to get slaves from other lands, so slavery went on, but it went on, it was Europeans enslaving other Europeans. You know, the Julius Caesar was from Italy, and he went to France and brought back 1 million slaves, right? So as the Roman Empire falls apart, slavery tends to go away, and this is because, mostly because the Romans didn't have the power anymore. Their empire was falling apart. And then the warlords from Germany, basically, who carved up the Roman Empire, set up all of their little small medieval kingdoms, and they bring slavery back in a big way and in a worse way. It's actually worse. It's more brutal. It's not more widespread. But then it gets eliminated, basically through Christianity, and we're going to take a look at that, but we've already seen some of these ideas. One of the key things that went on in the Middle Ages is, like, Christians were considered equals, at least in terms of church affairs. And so this was a major factor in just disseminating the idea of the New Testament. So, like, Christians would sit in church, and slaves would be sitting right there with non-slaves. And in fact, even in the early centuries of the church, like in the 200s, there's a famous slave, Callistus, who became a priest and even became a bishop. He's a former slave, a freed slave. So, and in fact, it was common, there's records in the ancient Roman times that record these things. They would have these church services where they freed a slave in church, and it was a special church service for the freeing of slaves. They were common in churches in the early centuries, and the records claim that there were thousands, the records from back then. Some slaves were even honored in the church as martyrs and remembered as, like, heroes of Christianity. So this really is going to transform, you know, because they're seen as equals in the eyes of God, children of God, okay? A church was built in the 500s to a martyred slave who had been martyred in the 300s in Ravenna, Italy. A very, very nice church. So you kind of get the idea. Now, Constantine is the first. We're going to go through like a few sort of major events here. Just sort of a list of things that happened, sort of major statements people made or political things that happened. So one of the first ones is the Roman Emperor Constantine imposed the death penalty for enslaving children. So he was the first Christian emperor, and one of the first things he did is if you enslaved a child, you would get the death penalty. Okay, so that's a new thing. All right. Then we've got in 372 AD. This is a rather famous one that really makes a lot of people angry. This Christian preacher by the name of Gregory, and he's called Gregory of Nyssa because Nyssa is the town he's from. Basically around 372 AD. So this is a long time ago. Okay, this is just before Rome falls. 372 AD. This is the first ever abolitionist. This is the first statement we have in history of anyone saying, "Hey, we shouldn't do slavery." We talked about what was going on in India and how they almost did. Well, this is the one. This is the guy. You know, sometimes they want to say, you know, China or something like. No, it's Gregory of Nyssa. Okay, so I've got the quote, a quote of him talking about this. There's more that he said about this, but I just got a quote for you from him. Okay, and so this is a translation. But anyway, it goes like this. I got me slaves and slave girls. For what price, tell me? What did you find in existence worth as much as this human nature? What price did you put on rationality? How many obols did you recommend the equivalent of the likeness of God? So remember, in the Old Testament, it says that we are God's image of Himself. So like, you get the idea there. Like, okay, God drew a picture of Himself. What should you pay for it? You know, He says, how many obols? Obols is like a, you know, like how many dollars basically did you reckon in, you know, you should pay for God's drawing of Himself? Okay. How many staters did you get for selling the being shaped by God? God said, let us make man in our own image and likeness. If he is in the likeness of God and rules the whole earth and has been granted authority over everything on earth from God, which it says that in Genesis, God tells mankind in general to rule the earth and subdue it. Who is his buyer? Tell me, who is his seller? To God alone belongs this power, or rather, not even to God Himself. For His gracious gifts, it says, are irrevocable. God would not therefore reduce the human race to slavery, since He Himself, when He had been enslaved to sin, when we had been enslaved to sin, spontaneously recalled us to freedom. But if God does not enslave what is free, who is he that sets his own power above God's? And this comes from Gregory's fourth homily on Ecclesiastes. Okay. So we'll keep moving forward. We've got some famous statements. The Christian philosopher Augustine, he's considered the architect of the thought of the Middle Ages. He's one of the most influential Christians who ever lived. He basically developed the idea of original sin. Augustine said, he lived from 354 to 430 AD. He said slavery was the product of sin in the world. That sin in the world is what has created slavery. Saint Chrysostom, who lived from 347 to 407, he said when Christ came, he annulled slavery and that slaves should be freed. Okay, Saint Patrick in Ireland, and we don't know exactly when, but in the 400s, he condemned slavery as evil. All right, now the Roman Emperor Justinian really gets the ball rolling, because remember, one of the issues is that under Roman law, it's illegal to free slaves. So when the Roman Empire fell, only the west fell. The eastern side kept going, and so Justinian is an Eastern Roman emperor, and he was emperor, I think, from 527 to 565 AD. And he was the first he abolished all laws against freeing slaves. So finally it was legal to free a slave. Okay. It doesn't mean that necessarily, slavery gets abolished, but you see how the ball keeps rolling throughout the Middle Ages. Then the next big event, we get to Bathilda in the 600s. And she is the queen of the Franks, a little country in what is modern-day France that will eventually become France. And in her kingdom, her husband is dead and her son is too young to come to the throne, so she rules it for a while. But during her time, she abolished slavery in her kingdom. So this is the first time that someone's just like, yeah, we're not going to do that because it's wrong. Except for, Wang Mang, who basically enslaved everyone in his own little way. She actually just abolished slavery and she did a big thing of buying all the slaves she could and freeing them. So slavery this is a major event in human history. This is the first time slavery is just abolished in the 600s in France. After her death, the church makes her a saint, and they use her name to continue to preach this idea. And of course it continues on, and then when you get to the 900s, the ball really gets rolling, and by the year 1000, it's gone. Alright, so then we talk about slavery makes a comeback. Slavery makes a comeback, and the way it makes a comeback is let's see. Well, we kind of covered it before. The Spanish Empire began to explore the New World, And it was the first time they enslaved foreigners was when they went to the Canary Islands in the middle of the Atlantic. So before Columbus even sailed the ocean blue, the Spanish were already enslaving, the people who live on the Canary Islands. If I remember right, it's the Canaries. Okay, and so they the Pope said, you're going to be kicked out of the church for this. You can't do that. So the Catholic Church maintained their position of absolutely not. And he's even saying he threatened people with excommunication, which would mean they would go to hell. He even says it's the devil that's behind this. And so the Catholic Church is going to continue throughout the whole time that slavery makes a comeback to issue statements saying this is against basically what they said all along. At this time when slavery came back, the Catholic Church didn't have a lot of power in that period, in the late 1400s, and then we move into the Protestant Reformation in the next century. But the Catholic Church didn't have a lot of power in that period because the Spanish Emperor Charles V, the Habsburg, had just sacked Rome. So which is where the head office of the Pope is. He didn't have the ability to actually get his statements published anywhere in the Spanish Empire without the Spanish Emperor's permission. Nonetheless, that was the position. The Catholic Church did work to make slavery less bad, too, on top of their continual statements that we can't do this. But it's the Protestants who really kind of got the ball rolling on it coming back. Well, the Spanish exploited it on a massive level. But what the Protestants did was let's explain this. Let's see how the Catholic Church had a long history of political maneuvering. So they had been fighting to get slavery legally banned, and they had been doing all sorts of stuff, and sometimes what they did wasn't so great, but sometimes they fought for good causes, politically. Well, when the Protestants come along, they don't know what they're up to, and so they kind of get taken over. So I'll give you an example. Martin Luther lives in Germany, and basically the Protestant Reformation starts in Germany with Martin Luther, basically. So the cities in Germany that had their own autonomy to do what they wanted, and the Catholic Church had very little power over in the 1500s, they didn't want to convert to Lutheran, to being and become Protestant. But the cities where the Catholic Church held a lot of power, and when I say the Catholic Church held a lot of power, I mean the Spanish Emperor ruled them. So understand that's how it works. The Emperor of Spain, Charles V, was also the King of Austria. He's a Habsburg. So when Charles V ascended to the throne, it was the Habsburgs are this incredible story of it was an empire that was created through the intricacies of dynastic royal succession. So imagine a family that has been the masters of marrying the right people for so long that eventually they rule everything. That's kind of what happens, right? So he's got northern Italy, Germany, Austria, Spain, Portugal, the New World, the Netherlands, and so anyway, what happens is the local lords over their little cities stand up to Charles V and say, no, we're going to be Protestant. And so they stood to gain a lot of political power by doing so. And they got it, and they got their way. And Germany became Germany and Lutheran. And so that's what happened there. That gives you an idea, what happened when the Protestant Reformation happened is the Catholic Church had all kinds of rules about you're not supposed to make war to go attack other people. and people wanted to, and so basically you could now become a Protestant. Some Protestant be like, I'm a Calvinist and I don't like you Jesuits, or I don't like you Huguenots, and we're going to go attack you and make war. And so there was a ton of that going on, and so the wars of religion become a thing where in the 1600s, and the Protestants basically get manipulated in this political game, although maybe they were okay with that. But they give a big thumbs up to enslaving non-Christians. So it's laid at the Protestants' feet there. So the Protestant Reformation is a big key in allowing slavery to come back in a big way. And of course, the lack of influence of the Catholic Church at the same time. And so slavery comes back in a big way. Well, eventually, something new happens. And so you can look it up online, just look up Christian abolitionism. So a grassroots movement begins in England and in the United States, where you have little Bible studies. It's not the Pope, or anything like that. It's just little Bible studies. Keep reading their Bibles and coming to the conclusion that slavery's wrong. And it becomes this very grassroots movement. And it takes a different route in England than what it does in the United States. So we'll get to England in a minute. But in the United States, what happens is all of the denominations split. So you have Southern Baptists, which is pro-slavery, and also pro-missions, because there was a split over whether or not you should do missions, because there were these primitive Baptists who were against missions. But he also had the American Baptists who were anti-slavery, who were an abolitionist group. So then you have the Southern Baptists in 1845 in Augusta, who are pro-slavery. Well, at the same time that, a split like that is happening, you've also got other splits going on, like Southern Presbyterian, Northern Presbyterian, Southern Methodist, Northern Methodist, Southern Episcopalian, Northern Episcopalian, Congregationalist, Southern, Northern. They're all splitting over the slavery issue. And the slavery issue eventually comes to a head in the American Civil War. Well, at the same time, in England, the same thing is happening. There's this grassroots Protestant Bible study abolitionist movement happening. And in England, it takes a different route. In America, we know what happens is this winds up in war. So if I can sum it up as simply as possible, you have this big split, and you have preachers in the South, and you can probably understand how the preachers in the South basically use the Bible to defend slavery, and then you got preachers in the North who use the Bible to oppose slavery. I think the preachers in the North were obviously right. I've already made that clear, but you could see how the Bible could be used the other way. And in the North, what they decide to do, one of the main issues is they have this thing where if you enter a northern state, then the slave is now free just by being in the northern state, and you can't transport a slave through a northern state. So if a slave just crosses the line into a northern state, then they're legally free. Okay. But that was against federal law, because the Congress of all the southern and northern states voting together had passed something called the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that because you had these northern free states and these southern slave states, and the Fugitive Slave Act said that any slave that escapes into a northern state must be returned. But that's not what went on at all. So instead you had this underground railroad, all you gotta do is just get across the line to a northern state and you're free, right? So eventually Abraham Lincoln gets elected president. He's a third party, out of nowhere candidate who is he's an abolitionist candidate, which he was the first one. He ran. He wanted to abolish slavery. Now, he was very clear. He wanted slavery to be abolished in America, the way that it got abolished over in England, because in England they abolished it politically. They just eventually, there was this main guy named William Wilberforce who was like this deeply devoted Christian who would just constantly give these speeches about the Bible and about his Christian belief and about how slavery was wrong. And he was like the main figurehead of that thing. Like it's just like he served on English Parliament like I think like his whole life. He was just like too old or something. And he kept fighting for that cause. So it's like, if you can imagine a politician who just has a cause that they keep fighting for, well, abolish slavery for Christian reasons was absolutely his thing. Like, he wouldn't shut up about it, you know. And so eventually it got abolished in England, and that's what Abraham Lincoln wanted to do in America. But it didn't go that way in America. The southern states, upon Lincoln's election, they seceded from the Union, and they cited two reasons for why they're no longer part of America, as far as they're concerned. Their first reason was the whole crossing Underground Railroad thing. You know, that was against the law as far as Congress was concerned, and they said, you know, you guys aren't these northern states they're not upholding the Constitution, so we're not part of you anymore. And the other thing was Abraham Lincoln. They believed that he was a threat and that he was absolutely going to come and use the U.S. Army to take away their slaves. And so those were the reasons that they gave. They issued documents, the declarations of the causes for secession. South Carolina, and then all of them do. And so then they fire on Fort Sumter because the way they see it, they are now that they have seceded and the Northerners didn't recognize their declaration of secession, of the immediate causes for secession. That's what's called, Declaration of the Immediate Causes for Secession. They're saying, well, now we're being occupied by a foreign power, and you don't have a right to be in our land. And so they fire. The first shots are fired. Everyone thinks that the war is going to be fast because they thought God was on their side on both sides. But the war's not fast. Lincoln is very clear that he does not want he wants slavery to end. He's an abolitionist candidate, but he doesn't want it to end this way through war. He wanted it to end the way it ended in England. Well, that didn't happen, and how do you put it? The war was really long, and like a super amount of Americans died, and eventually Lincoln realized that like we've got to do away with the slavery thing. And so like understand that there were some slave states who actually fought for the Union, but he was able to get the Emancipation Proclamation passed and get the amendments ratified to end slavery, and slavery gets ended in the United States. And then so now it's ended and so then largely through the efforts of the British Empire, the slave trade gets ended around the world, but because of economic pressure. Because, you know, hey, England in 1910 was this giant world empire on which the sun never set, and they used that power to push places like China that abolished slavery in 1910, or, you know, Afghanistan in 1923, places like this where slavery was still a thing. They used their power to, you know, basically they controlled trade. And so economic control was under England, and England pushed their influence. And, you know, this is a colonial effort. They're pushing their ideas and their beliefs on foreigners, but at the same time, in this case, you kind of got to go with them. It's like, yeah, China, you know, 1910 is a little late to be banning slavery. Let's not do that, you know. Of course, Japan didn't go that route, and then they became a fascist power in the 1930s. And so they utilized slavery on a massive scale. The Germans, they were obviously okay with slavery, and so a massive war had to be fought. And then we were able to end some other slavery, you know, that had been going on. And then, of course, there's the question of what exactly do you call communist Russia? It's incredibly oppressive. I don't know if it's out and out slavery. It's just a massive level of oppression of the people, and it's tyrannical, and there's massive murder. But hey, you're in the 20th century at this point. I think you kind of catch the drift. Slavery's still going on in a lot of places around the world, and there's still pressure for it to change. Remember, Saudi Arabia didn't get rid of slavery until 1962, and then it continued on for decades. And so this is where we're at today. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for your time. Hey, there's one important detail. It's not really a detail, but there's a really important thing that I just realized that I left out, and I'm going to come in at the end here and talk about the Middle Ages again. But in the Middle Ages, we talked about how slavery was ended, and you can see the influence of Paul. Remember in Ephesians 6, Paul said, "Obey one another." And so this is kind of, it seems like that's kind of what they were trying to do. Like if you look at what happened, as slavery was ended in the Middle Ages, they moved from slavery to the feudal system, a feudal economy. And the feudal system involves people who are serfs, not slaves. Well, what's the difference between a serf and a slave? Sometimes people will argue and say, oh, a serf is basically a slave. Well, no, serfs are definitely not slaves. But they're definitely, not free people in like the modern sense that we would think of. So a serf is this fascinating intermediate missing link. It's like, if you think of evolution and you've got a fish and then you've got like a lizard, and you say the fish evolved into the lizard, and it's like, well, how did that happen? It's like, well, in between there's kind of like a frog, some sort of in-betweeny animal that's kind of a fish and kind of a lizard, because like frogs start out as they swim underwater, and then later in life they have legs. So the feudal system is like, it's like the evolutionary interspecies midpoint, between slavery and the modern concept of freedom. So slavery is abolished in the Middle Ages by 1000 AD, but the feudal system is established. We wouldn't think of the feudal system as, the normal concept of being free to us, but it's definitely not slavery. So let's just get into the details. Essentially, under the feudal system, one of the first issues is the serf is bound to the land. So that means that the serf cannot leave the land. He can't be taken off the land. He can't leave the land. He's bound to like his land where he lives, and he can go where he wants as long as he shows back up and farms the land, But the serf is bound to the land. So there's a difference with slavery right there. Slavery involved capturing people and taking them somewhere else. Julius Caesar, remember, he brought back 1 million slaves in his Gallic Wars to his home. The serf is going to be bound to his land. His children are going to be bound to that land. And the land of the serfs will be ruled by the local lord. So the duke or the count or the whatever. The earldoman, and the earl, right, will rule the local land. And the serfs will basically have to do what he says. He'll be like their judge. They are not slaves, like no one's making them work. Rather, they just pay rents to him. So they're not being forced to do anything or told what to do. They just have a plot of land and they're expected to, farm it and then give him some of what, they farm from it. But they're never going to really get ahead in this system. But at the same time, so if the serf wants to get married, then he has to get his lord's approval. Okay? The flip side of this is when the lord of the land wants to make a major move, the serfs, he has to go before the serfs and get their vote. So, say he wants to marry, some other lord next door's daughter, then the commoners or the serfs, they vote on that. And so basically, when the serf wants to make a major move, he has to get his lord's approval. But when the lord wants to make a major move, the commoners vote on that. So like you can see, like, this is more democratic. Like, nobody's totally free from anyone. Everybody has to obey each other, you know, in a sense. So this is where the concept of parliament comes from the English, from the French parler, which means to talk. And Parliament has the House of Lords and the House of Commons, right? The House of Serfs and the House of Lords. Okay, the one person under the feudal system who didn't have to answer to anyone was the king, and he could kind of do what he wanted. But in different times and different places, like in France, eventually the king was able to have absolute power and could do what he wanted, and it became really oppressive. But in England, the lords got together and made him sign the Magna Carta, which did, in I think it was 1215 AD, which basically put a lot of economic restrictions on what kind of taxes he could levy on them. So it's like everybody has some sort of say in the system. But the serf's not really free in our sense, because like he can't like just go work somewhere else because someone's going to pay him more, and she can't either. That arose later, and that's a shift from the end of the feudal system, the end of serfdom, and the movement into being, you know, free peasants. And so that's a different thing, and you can see how these beliefs in human equality and beliefs that every human is of sacred value, not only is that going to abolish slavery, but it's going to create ideas that lead to concepts of basic rights that everyone should have. So like, you know, the basic right to not be a slave, but then what other rights does someone have? Eventually that gets worked out more and more over time. And it moves into like other ideas of like basic rights. But the whole idea that like everyone has certain intrinsic rights, like to vote, that's an idea that emerged over time. And people didn't really believe that at first. It took a while. So like, for example, in America, women got the right to vote, and was like 1908, I think. But poor men got the right to vote like 4 years before that. And it wasn't, people felt like, you know, the poor people had a say on the local level, and then that's where the local government guy had to answer to them, and then the government guy has a say at the higher level. And so it is a kind of a system of shared back and forth. So the idea that like everyone should vote in the federal government is a newer idea, you know, men and women, etc. But you can see how these ideas sort of develop. One of the keys that you know ended the feudal system, at least in some places, it took a while to end in other places. So like Spain and France, you know, kind of stayed in the feudal system, but it ended in a lot of places because of the bubonic plague in the 1300s. Was a major blow because there was 30 to 60% of people died, which means you have a shortage of workers. And so then people started offering workers money to like, hey, come work for me, because, you know, laborers become the hot commodity. And there's a huge population decrease. There's other famines that happen because of the Little Ice Age at the same time. And so you have a shift into free peasantry. And then I think it's in the 13 and 1400s, I don't remember exactly, you have these things, and I think in France and England, you have the peasant revolts, which these are unprecedented in history. You have these poor people revolting, and there's a, you know, an angry, violent uprising. What are they mad about? Well, they're not revolting against the fact that they're peasants. They're not trying to take over and rule. So like when you had slave revolts in the past, like under Spartacus in the Roman Empire, he was trying to take over the Roman Empire, and then he's going to be the emperor, or whoever, you know, him and the other warlord with him, you know. But like that's not, the peasant revolts weren't about that. They weren't trying to take over. They just said, hey, our peasant rights aren't being recognized. So that was the first time that ever happened in history, that like people said, you know, my rights as a peasant, I just want that, and I'm going to go to war for that. You know, so that's unprecedented in history. So these ideas that like all people are children of God, and we should obey each other in the New Testament, it leads to this idea that like, hey, everyone is equal and of equally sacred value, and that creates a system where like, okay, then each people have certain rights that are just given to them because of their status before God, and you can't disrespect them. So it's like we're all nobility in a sense as far as God's concerned. And so that leads to things like people have a right to, eventually, at least the idea, to go where they want, to do what they want, to work for who they want, basic liberties, basic freedoms, the right to own what they want, to buy stuff, to have money or sell stuff, Like under the feudal system, they didn't have that yet. The lord had a title, the Earl of so-and-so. And so he could like own private property. He could win it in war, lose it in war, sell it, buy it, make loans. But the serf didn't really have property. He and his family were bound to like a plot of land. And it wasn't his property that he could sell or exchange. That's him. He's bound to that land. But the right to private property is a right that eventually develops. The right to not be taxed too much, and to not be enslaved. And eventually the belief that you should be able to, believe what you want to believe and worship, what you want to worship, that develops much, much later. People didn't believe in that for a long time, and to some degree, it really seemed to first emerge in the United States. But that's a whole other discussion for a whole other time. I just needed to add this in about the feudal system. So once again, thank you for your time. Hello, this is Ben. If you enjoyed this video but you still have more questions, then check out my blog at benjoiner.home.blog, or you can check out other videos on this channel which hopefully are organized well enough into playlists where you can see them. And of course, you should be able to find linked everywhere my email, social media, and you can contact me however you want. Have a great day.